Let's start. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the political economy session of the 26th ERF annual conference series. It's too bad that we are not able to have this face-to-face fantastic ERF conference that we usually have each year. Hopefully, we will pick up from where we left from next year on, hopefully in Cairo. But this year we are having the conference online. We have had some excellent sessions in the conference, and hopefully today's session will also be very, we will have some intriguing discussion. And I mean, we are going to have already 4 excellent papers to be presented. We plan to have at most 20 minutes per paper, and we are. I'm going to discuss the 4 papers. I plan to limit my discussion to 15 minutes, and then we are going to have the Q&A session. So participants, please put your questions to the. I mean, you can also raise your hands, but we prefer to have it online. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, so that you can write up your questions. We are going to have the speakers will have time to answer the questions at the end, right? So we are not going to have questions during the presentations. The order of the presentation will be the same as the as the paper appears in the program. So we are going to start with Cyrine. Let me see. Okay, so let me check it once again that we are doing it correctly. Sorry for, yeah, this one. Okay, so let's start with Cyrine. Okay. Sorry, Alexandra is first, right? So okay, so it's good to check it always. So Alexandra will be the first speaker. So is it right, Alexandra? So yours is the first paper in the program, right?
Yeah, I mean, it okay, doesn't so matter if
that's how I go first. Yeah, that's how I see in the order of the. Okay, so let's have Alexandra first then. So Alexandra Irani is a project research manager in the Applied Economics and Development Research Group of the American University of Beirut. So Alexandra, the floor is yours. So.
Great, thanks a lot, Samir. I'm just gonna share my screen. All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making it. I'm Alexandra Irani, and I'm a researcher from the American University of Beirut. I'm presenting 2 years' work on measuring the impact of multi-purpose cash transfers on the well-being of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I'm presenting on behalf of a multidisciplinary team of researchers from AUB, Chaaban, Hala, Ghattas, Nisreen, Salti, Wael, Moussa, Zeina, Jamaluddine, and Rima Al-Mokdad. I'm going to go over quickly over the background, objectives of the paper, data and empirical strategy, a subset of the findings, and a quick conclusion. A quick background on Syrian refugees in Lebanon. As you may already know, Lebanon hosts the world's largest refugee population per capita. We have around 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, of which around 900,000 are registered with UNHCR. 73% live below the poverty line of 114 per person per month, dollars, and 55% live below the lower poverty line set at $87 per person per month, which is quite a big proportion. And about the multi-purpose cash program, or MPC, that we're measuring in our study. So starting November 2017, WFP, the World Food Programme, joined UNHCR and other organizations in the delivery of MPC to eligible households over a 12-month period. And this amounted to $175 per household per month over 12 months. So every cash cycle starts in November and it's for 12 months. And with this program, a study was commissioned by Chameleon, the Cash Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning Organizational Network, and the MPC Steering Committee in Lebanon, for the main objective of measuring the causal impact of this MPC program on multiple dimensions of well-being, including expenditures, food security, housing, water and sanitation, education, employment, and health. And what the study specifically tackles is the variation in duration of MPC. And so interestingly, we are able to measure the short-term impact of MPC, so households who received MPC for one cash cycle, so 12 months or less, and households who received long-term MPC for more than one cash cycle, in our case, 2 cash cycles for 12 months or more. And we also look for the first time in this setting and in general in this humanitarian setting, the impact of discontinuation from cash transfers. And so the knowledge gap we aim to fill is twofold. First, we find a significant variation in the evidence available on cash transfers in development settings. Most of the evidence is concentrated on the impact of cash on food security outcomes, but we have more limited evidence on health, education, shelter, and sanitation. We tackle this through our multi-purpose and multidimensional outcomes. There's also a big dearth in the evidence base of cash-based interventions in humanitarian settings, which is something we tackle. And so while some impact evaluations have been conducted in Lebanon, this study is the first to analyze duration variability, so looking at short-term versus long-term cash, and discontinuation from cash transfers, using multiple waves of data collection. Okay, and so over this 2-year study, we conducted a household survey implemented across 3 regions in Lebanon, the Bekaa, North, and Mount Lebanon, where 85% of the Syrian refugee population is concentrated, over three waves of data collection, 6 months apart. And so if you look at the timeline, the cash cycle started in November 2017, the first cash cycle. And we run our first wave of data collection 9 months after the first cash cycle. So we'd be measuring the impact of 9 months of cash. And then there's the second cash cycle that starts in November 2018. And then we have our second wave in February 2019 and our third wave of data collection in July 2019. We interview a total of 11,457 households. And basically what we do is measure the causal impact of MPC during each wave by comparing those who receive cash to those who do not. How is eligibility determined? Households are selected on a yearly basis. So for every cash cycle, we have an updated proxy means tested formula that assigns to each household a vulnerability score. This score is basically the predicted household monthly expenditure of the household. And this score is predicted using sociodemographic characteristics from the UNHCR registration database for the whole Syrian refugee population. Based on this score, or this predicted expenditure, households are ranked from most to least vulnerable. And all households who have a score below the $87 poverty line are eligible for the MPC program. And UNHCR employs a geographical bottom-up targeting by including the most vulnerable households in each geographic region until the region's allocated proportion is reached, given the budget constraints. And WFP follows a bottom-up approach to distribute MPC and also starts from the most vulnerable to the least until the funding is fully dispersed. And so the point at which the funding is fully dispersed, and this happens below the poverty line at 87 because of funding shortages. This creates an arbitrary cutoff line that is region and wave specific because of the geographic targeting. So we get multiple arbitrary cutoff lines. And ultimately, households on either side of the cutoff or this arbitrary cutoff line are plausibly similar. And any difference in outcomes can be attributed to the causal impact of MPC. And this is why this impact evaluation makes use of this natural like quasi-experiment, and we run a fuzzy regression discontinuity design. It's fuzzy because, as you can see in the graph on the right, the probability of getting MPC is close to 1, but it's not equal. It's not sharp. It's fuzzy, although it's quite close to sharp. Also, an important point which determined our duration variability is the fact that the yearly estimation of the PMT formula led to a big shift of MPC beneficiaries, and this estimation and shift happened in between wave 1 and wave 2 of the project. And so this enabled us to, instead of just looking at the impact of receiving cash versus no cash, we were able to come up with the following 3 treatment groups and compare them to the control group. Basically, we have, so the time, the axis shows the number of months of receiving cash. If you look on the left, you have the discontinued group, who ultimately received cash in the first cash cycle for 12 months, and then were discontinued and measured after 4 months, and after 10 months of getting discontinued. We have, so these were measured in wave 2 and wave 3. We have the short-term MPC group that was measured after 4 months, 9 months, and 10 months of receiving cash, and the long-term MPC group who was measured after 16 and 22 months of receiving cash. All of these groups are compared to the control group who was not eligible to receive cash in either cash cycle in our project duration. And so for our outcomes of interest, the outcome of interest Y, we calculate the fuzzy RDD late. And basically what we do is we estimate the difference in the outcome Y as the score approaches the cutoff C. And we divide this by the difference in the probability of receiving MPC from both sides of the cutoff. Now the denominator basically is the fuzzy part of our RD. And each component of the late is obtained through a non-parametric estimation of our outcome and of MPC as a separate function of the score on each side of the cutoff C. The functions on each side are fitted using a kernel-weighted local polynomial regression. And the advantages of using RDD are the fact that estimators of the late are unbiased around the cutoff score or our arbitrary cutoff line. And our estimate can be interpreted as causal if the assumptions hold, the following 2 assumptions hold. The first one is that the running variable, in our case, we have 2 running variables, which is the PMT score for the first cash cycle and the PMT score for the second cash cycle. So we want the running variable not to exhibit discontinuity at the threshold and therefore no sign of score manipulation. We test this using the McCreary density test, and the test holds for the 3 waves. And the second assumption would be that observable household characteristics are also continuous at the cutoff line, the arbitrary cutoff line. We test this using running balance checks over a large pool of socio-demographic variables, and they all hold. For the results, we're going to go over the multiple dimensions, and what we present here is a subset of the overall results obtained in the project and presented in the main project report. For household expenditures, just before going into the results, for each result we're going to be showing a bar graph. And for each treatment group, we're going to have a bar. So we have the control group on the left, always in gray, the discontinued short-term and long-term group. And when the bar is color-filled, it shows statistically significant results at the 10% level. For our first dimension, we find that MPC led to a significant increase in total reported monthly expenditure. And this increase is from 486.9 in the control group to 581.9 in the long-term MPC group. We also find a significant increase in food expenditure of $32.7 also for the long-term MPC group. This is an interesting finding because all households in our sample, whether they receive or not MPC, they all receive the WFP food assistance, $27 per person per month. And so above and beyond receiving this food assistance, we find an increase in food expenditure when households receive MPC in the long term. For housing, wash, and sanitation, for housing, we find no significant impact on changes in rent expenditures or residential housing as opposed to non-residential housing or living in informal tented settlements. This is an expected finding, which was discussed with the humanitarian sector, because Syrian refugees already reached Lebanon and faced a saturated housing market. This saturated housing market cannot be tackled just through a cash assistance program. Refugees face housing tenure, issues with landlord-tenant relationships, and moving housing from residential, like from informal tented settlements to residential, would require more than just a monthly cash transfer. For water and sanitation, we find that MPC leads to a significant increase in households reporting sufficient access to drinking water for all treatment groups. We find a 15 to 32 percentage point increase compared to the control group. When we look at other outcomes in this dimension, we don't find a significant, we don't detect any significant impact. We looked at access to private toilets or access to sufficient washing and cooking water. That is also explained with the same rationale that having access to sufficient cooking and washing water would require access to sanitation and pipes and municipal services, and all of this would require something beyond a simple cash transfer to link households to the municipalities and have access to these services. For education, we find a significant increase in formal school enrollment in the short-term and long-term groups for children aged between 5 and 14. And this is an interesting finding because the cost of education was cited as the main reason for not enrolling children in our target population. For employment, we find an interesting impact, gendered impact, quite a different impact for men and women. When looking at men, long-term MPC allows them to be more selective about the jobs they take and possibly leave hazardous or unfair work conditions. How we find this conclusion is because we see a significant decrease in employment for men, not shown in the graph. And this is paralleled by a significant increase in unemployed men in the long-term group. And so what happens is that this decrease in employment is not paralleled by an increase in inactivity, but instead men remain in the labor force and continue to actively seek work. And a qualitative assessment conducted also in this project, MPC and non-MPC male beneficiaries explain that MPC does not make them want to leave work, but instead it helps them leave hazardous and risky jobs and allows them to look for jobs with better conditions.
Alexandra, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. As for the impact on women, now we know that women, Syrian refugee women in this context already have a low labor force participation rate. If you look on you look at the graph on the right, female inactivity among the control group is already high at 86.6%. In the qualitative assessment, women mentioned that they would prioritize household work and childcare, and would want to avoid working in hazardous, low-paying jobs. And so what MPC does is, graph on the right, we see that in the long-term MPC group, we have an increase in female inactivity. And on the left, we see that we have an increase in employment among females in the discontinued group. So On the right, we see that MPC allowed women to actually pursue what they mentioned to be their priorities, prioritize housework and childcare. And on the left, we see that the discontinued group who lost income and lost access to MPC was actually forced to look and get access to the labor market, look for work. Food security, we look at household food security, which is measured using the Food Insecurity Experience Scale by FAO, so the FIES. The score takes a value from 0 to 8, with 8 being the with 8 showing the highest levels of food insecurity. And we see that that MPC decreased significantly FIES from 4.9 to 4 for the long-term MPC group. And this is a significant impact. I mean, a score of 0.9 over 8 is quite a significant decrease. For health, we look at access to healthcare and mental health. And we find that MPC led to a significant increase in access to any type of primary healthcare among those who needed it. So we asked all individuals whether they needed healthcare, and we asked different categories of healthcare: preventative, chronic, accident, injury, diagnostic. And then we asked them if they actually access this healthcare. We find a significant increase in this access for the long-term MPC group. And we also see a significant increase in the discontinued group compared to the control group, an indication that even though MPC was discontinued, the impact is still significant and detectable post discontinuation. And we also see, not in the graph, that a significant and even larger increase in access to PHC among children, because as we know, usually households prioritize need and access for children, both children under 5 and children between 5 and 19 years of age. Last result, and very interesting one, access to long-term MPC actually tripled the number of respondents who reported having good mental health. This was a nice finding. And the mental health of proxy respondents was assessed only in one of our waves, the last one, using the 5-item validated version of the mental health inventory, the MHI-5 in Arabic. MHI-5 is widely used in surveys of general health and is a good predictor of anxiety, depression, behavioral control, and general distress. As a quick conclusion, the main takeaway messages from the results are: 1, most of the detected impact materializes in the long-term MPC group. We don't really see impact in the short-term MPC group. And this accentuates the need to have access to longer duration MPC or institute longer MPC, longer cash cycles. So right now, the cash cycles in Lebanon targeting Syrian refugees are for 12 months. These findings would actually indicate it would be interesting to consider longer cash cycles. And the second takeaway message is that the benefits of MPC faded within a short term. So the impact of discontinuation was measured 4 to 10 months after discontinuation. So this MPC impact faded for most outcomes measured and slightly dropped to pre-assistance levels for others. These two messages are important because funding shortages have spurred yearly discussions regarding the recalibration of the targeting formula that determines the eligibility of this MPC cash program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for the very nice presentation and for being, punctual in terms of the time of presentation. Our next speaker is Talha Yalta. So he's going to present the co-authored paper, The Determinants of Defense Spending in the Gulf Region, Evidence from Seemingly Unrelated Regressions. Talha Yalta is an associate professor in the Department of Economics of Tob University of Economics and Technology. I think that he's experiencing a technical problem. We will not be able to see him, but hopefully we will be able to see his slides. Yes, we are seeing, and hear his voice. Okay, Talha Hoca, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're hearing me, and also you can see the slides show my screen share, right?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, I will be able to present, but this video thing just happened right now, and I didn't want to try to fix it and lose time and reconnect and etc. So sorry in advance for the slide problem. But anyway, the name of the paper is The Determinants of Defense Spending in the Gulf Region, Evidence from Seemingly Unrelated Regressions. This is a joint work with Yasemin Yalta from Hacettepe University. This, I think, turned out to be a quite interesting paper for our standards. And I also prepared a relatively detailed presentation for you guys, but due to the time limitations, I think I will try to be a little punctual and just talk briefly about some of these parts. But the presentation is a good summary of the whole paper, and both the paper and the presentation will be available for your if you want to take a look at it later. Anyway, for the motivation part, as you know, there are 8 countries in the Gulf region, and the interesting thing is these 8 countries, although they are relatively small in terms of population, they account for 8% of the global military expenditures, which is milex. Okay, and this has been actually increasing over the last years, and actually 3 of these 10 countries have the world's highest military budgets in the world, and these are Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Kuwait. So this is interesting, and the high milex represents, of course, an important burden for these countries, because these funding can be, this budget and these resources could be used for other things such as education, health, or infrastructure, or even investment for other things. And also they can be used to fight education problems, health problems. They can be used to fight unemployment, poverty, income equality. So these countries maybe have better things to do with these resources. So why the governments in the Gulf region keep increasing their milex despite potentially negative effects on growth? This is an important question to answer, which we try to answer in this paper. And when we do this, analyzing the determinants of milex, we can help the policymakers how they can decrease these expenditures for military and reallocate resources toward development-related goals rather than the defense. So I think this is an important topic to study. And there are, of course, a few papers on this topic, but most of the existing papers focus on economic and socio-political factors, GDP, and etc. Strategic factors are generally ignored, which we address here. And also, these strategic, of course, dimension is important because there are, as you know, hostilities and alliances are commonplace in the neighborhood, and these countries adjust their military expenditures by looking at each other, what they are doing. And of course, 6 of the countries are also members of the Gulf Security Council. And so there is also a game theoretic aspect of the whole thing. And of course, there are spillover effects and free rider problems potentially. And finally, the role of the United States is important in the region, so that can be also strategically addressed. So the contribution is, of course, we use a partial adjustment model here and the security web framework, which I will briefly explain later. And this approach allows us to take into account real-world rigidities. And this is, to our best of knowledge, this is the first study to calculate calculate long-run elasticities for this country group. And we use seemingly unrelated regressions methodology. And we use annual data between 1980 and 2016. Literature review, I'm gonna mostly skip this part, but there are a few papers, earlier papers on this topic. But of course, they slightly differ from each other in terms of their scope and the years and the main things that they are studying. Let's talk a little bit about the methodology. the methodology is, as I explained, as I mentioned earlier, it's a partial adjustment process. Here, at a given time, a country has a desired level of military expenditure, and the adjustment to this optimal level occurs only gradually, right? So why is this? This is because of several reasons, such as the lobbying power of interest groups, contractual obligations, overhead costs of dismantling an existing system, so on and so forth. So such effects can be examined through a series of adjustments in the mileage between subsequent years, where the country tries to reach the desired long-run equilibrium level over time. Okay, so I think this is a nice way to approach this problem, and we of course adopt the partial adjustment process, which is well known. Here, MX is the observed level of military expenditure, and MX star is the desired and unobserved long run, right? So, and the delta is the coefficient of adjustment, which has to be between 0 and 1. And we arrange this equation and add a demand model to it. Here, the X is the vector of variables explaining mileage. They are both economic and strategic variables. And we combine these to obtain our econometric model, which is seen here. And for the estimation, we employ the seemingly unrelated regressions SUR technique, which is also a well-known technique. Now, this is a panel method, this is also a multi-equation model. Here, each of the 8 countries have each their own equation. But the important thing here is that in the system, all of the countries are linked in their error terms, right? So the error terms, as you know, contains randomly looking deviations. But here, because the countries are in the same area, are interlinked both socially, economically, and politically, the error term is expected to be correlated between the equations, right? So this allows us to both address data and modeling uncertainties, right? Because this is somehow taken account by the correlation in the error term, and also obtain better estimates, more efficient estimates, right? So this is, I think, good way to analyze in terms of the econometric approach. These are also explained in more detail in the paper. So this is our final specification, and these are some details. Let's talk about the data. I want to talk more about the results. This is why I'm trying to talk fast and skip to the other parts. Sorry for this, but anyway, in terms of the variables, we have 2 groups of variables, both economic variables and strategic variables. And for the economic variables, we have the real GDP, population, and real oil price. These are commonly used in the literature. So, so we also decided to adopt these variables. For the strategic variables, we have the military expenditure of the allies, military expenditure of the rivals, and military expenditure of the United States in the region. But of course, these allies and rivals differ from equation to equation. For example, the rival countries, Saudi Arabia for Iran and Iran for the rest of the countries. And for all countries except Iran, the ally is the other GCC countries. And Iran doesn't have an ally in the region, so its ally variable shows the rest of the GCC. And we do this in order to determine the degree to which GCC countries diverge from Saudi Arabia, the leading power. So this is an interesting thing that we are looking also. And the US is an ally for GCC countries, but it's also a threat for Iran. And so these are the setup. And the final data set is, as I said earlier, annual and covers the period between 1980 and 2016. These are the sources, which are all in the paper. And there has been some missing values, which were fixed with other data sources from Bureau of Arms Control. Anyway, let's take a look at the data graphically, but actually, these are the real military expenditure and real GDP of the countries. And of course, we see that they are moving together. So as the GDP increases, the military expenditures also increase in general. And this is for the other countries. This is, for example, this is Bahrain, this is Qatar, this is UAE, and this is Oman. So we have 8 countries and 8 graphs. Anyway, I want to talk a little more in more detail about the empirical results. Okay, so before going into the tables, looking at the tables, I just want to mention 2 things. First of all, this partial adjustment model is known to be susceptible to autocorrelation. So we run the Lund-Box Q test, and we see that the independence is not rejected, right? So we check for the autocorrelation problem. Also, we run the normality tests, these are important for the SUR methodology, and also testing for normality, we do not reject it. Okay, and this is the regression results. I know it looks a little bit intimidating because we have 8 countries, and these are the so this is 8 models actually, but it is it's a system of system of equations, and these are the variables. The important variable here is the log of real milex. So this actually 1 minus this gives us the adjustment rate. For example, this is 1 minus 0.35 is roughly 0.65, as you know. So this means that at each year, at each period, Saudi Arabia is able to adjust 65% towards its desired level of military expenditures, right? So this is one important part of the paper, and these are, of course, the economic and strategic variables, as I mentioned earlier. I want to explain this table in terms of several important topics that we obtained in the study, several important findings. Here in the table, we see that the parameter estimates have the expected signs in general, which is good. And also a large population of the coefficients are statistically significant, which is also good. And this is thanks to the improved efficiency provided by the SUR method. So we have that. And also, in general, the lagged military expenditures have a positive and significant effect on milex in all specifications, confirming the existence of inertia. So this is also in line with earlier papers. And the coefficients of lagged milex are smaller than 1. So this is also important because this shows that our model is dynamically stable in all of the 8 cases. And also we see that the adjustment coefficient, which is 1 minus the estimated coefficient, is generally high across the region. So we have a generally high rate of adjustment across the region. So these are our main findings and important points about the stability and the efficiency and robustness of our model. And the high coefficient of adjustments is actually not surprising because these countries, you know, are some of the largest military spenders in the world. So this is also not surprising. Okay. Now, about the adjustment variable, which I mentioned a little bit earlier on the table. Right. In Saudi Arabia, this is 65%, which is a good value, and which means that the 65% of between the desired and actual milex is eliminated on average on each year, right? Now, other countries have relatively high or low adjustment rates, which can be explained with different levels of threat, economic problems, as well as free riding behavior on other bigger countries. And also noteworthy is that Iran has a rather low adjustment rate, which is only 0.27%, which is about 27%. We think that this can be due to the international sanctions constraining its ability to adjust its milex towards its optimal level. And about the economic variables, I want to mention a few things also. Now, the results reveal that the determinants of milex shows variations across different countries. So this is different for each country. Real GDP, for example, has a positive effect on milex in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain. However, in smaller countries such as Qatar and UAE and Oman, real GDP is not statistically significant. So in Kuwait, demand for milex decreases as income increases, which indicates that security is perceived as an inferior good. So these are all in the literature. And as for the effects of population, the results show that a positive effect is more prevalent in Kuwait, while civilian needs seem to dominate in Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain. I don't want to go too much into detail here, but the population parameter being positive and negative both have an explanation in the literature. So it is both cases are possible. And also we see that the price of oil has a significant effect only in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, right? So for other countries such as UAE and Qatar, there's an insignificant effect, which we explain this with the efforts in these countries towards economic diversification, especially the UAE, right? Such as tourism and other things, which is a good thing.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, okay. I think I'm good. So anyway, about the strategic variables, we also have some interesting findings here also. The results point to some interesting findings, such as both Saudi Arabia and Iran react positively to the milex of each other, right? This confirms that the two countries see the opposite as a threat, opposite side as a threat. So this is expected. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Bahrain, and Qatar increase their milex to keep up with other countries in the region. So this indicates that there is perhaps no free riding among the GCC countries. This is also an interesting finding. Iraq, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman decrease their milex in response to an increase in the US spending. So this also shows that these countries rely on the US for their external security, which is in line with the earlier literature. And the results show that Kuwait is the only country viewing the US milex as a complementary, even though it relies on the US for protection as well. Right. Also, we run tests on parameter constancy. This model allows us to run tests across equations, so we can find interesting things here as well. We run these tests, we run this series of Wael tests to see if the parameters are constant for different variables. For example, the adjustment parameter, we reject that it is the same for each country. So we can confirm here that the adjustment is different for each country, the adjustment rate. And also other parameters also give similar results. So each country has a different determinant, if you will, about the defense spending, military spending. But there is one interesting exception we found, which is that the parameter for the military expenditure of the allies, the GCC countries, its p-value is 0.5, which is very high. So actually we do not reject that the parameter for military expenditure is the same for all GCC countries, right? So what does this mean? This means that, in other words, the hypothesis that the GCC countries do not free ride on each other's milex is not rejected. So the GCC countries are actually coordinate their military spending. So this is also a good finding, which is seen in the results. In other variables, our tests confirm that milex is influenced by different factors and with a high degree of heterogeneity in this region. So this is confirmed. We also estimate point elasticities for both long run and for the short run for each variable. I won't talk too much about this, I don't have time, but in general, in line with the theory, the long run elasticities are larger than short run elasticities in all countries, and especially the income elasticity is substantially higher in Iran and Bahrain, exceeding 1. The sensitivity of milex to changes in population increases over time. In Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and Kuwait, this elasticity becomes greater than unity in the long run. And the short run elasticity with respect to oil price is 0.5 in Kuwait, while it's just 0.09 and 0.18 for Bahrain and Oman. These are all explained in the paper. So let's talk finally about the conclusion. Let's talk about some policy implication, and this is just one page. So I think I'll be over in a minute. So after running all these research and looking at these countries in an extensive model with lots of data, it's our understanding that there is room for better coordination among the GCC countries to reduce their milex in favor of development programs. Such planning can also bring more flexible policies to avoid long-term defense contracts, an important obstacle for reducing milex in the region. And also, we see that while Kuwait views the US presence as a complement, Iraq, Bahrain, and Qatar regard it as a substitute, resulting in free-riding behavior. If the US decides to reduce its milex, these countries may in turn need to increase theirs. And oil prices have been influential in the milex of some countries, namely Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. And I think we think that these countries have more to gain by diversifying their economies, following the footsteps of other similar countries such as UAE, and diversify their economies to decrease dependence on oil revenues. In conclusion, the 8 countries, as well as the US, may benefit from re-evaluating their security policies in the Gulf region. So thank you very much. I think it's okay for the time.
Okay, right. Yeah. So I think you have one question, but let's answer it at the end. So okay. There is one question for you in the Q&A box. Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much. Our next speaker is Cyrine Hannafi. She's a postdoctoral candidate at the University of Paris Vitae. The title of the paper that she's going to present is Economic and Social Integration of Syrian Refugees and Their Intention to Stay in Germany. I think it's a quoted paper with Ali Marouani. Okay, Cyrine, you can start.
Okay, so please activate the share of screen. It's okay. I think it's okay. So thank you so much. So today I'm so pleased to present to you my paper entitled Economic and Social Integration of Syrian Refugees and Their Intention to Stay in Germany, which is co-authored with Mr. Mohamed Ali Marouani. We know all that the Syrian conflict has led to big waves of refugees all over the world. And in particular, some European countries such as Germany welcomed big waves of refugees and invested hugely in their integration in order to compensate for its labor market shortage. So one of the main important issue is about the decision to return to Syria after the conflict, or the decision to stay permanently in the host country, because a return to Syria or a move from the host country means a loss of human capital for countries like Germany. So that's why we will develop this issue in our paper. Moreover, so what we see in the context of Syrian refugees in Germany is that although the efforts made by the German government in order to finance some voluntary return, there is a very tiny proportion of people that would like to go home. So even if the conflict has ended in some regions of Syria, so that maybe reveals the effectiveness of the integration process in Germany. The research questions of the paper. Sorry, I'm not. Okay. So that's why the first question, or the first main question of the paper, is about the impact of integration on this decision to stay permanently in Germany or not. And our focus on this paper is rather on the decision to stay permanently in Germany, because we do not have information about the return, and that we would like really to see the impact of integration and the integration policies in the host country. Moreover, we deepen the debate by distinguishing between both economic and social integration, and we would like also to investigate some determinants of both economic and social integration, including also the two-way causality between them, because we argue that social integration would also facilitate access to jobs, and economic integration would facilitate or would create social networks than social inclusion. Moreover, we are also interested in investigating some other relevant determinants from the literature of the three outcome of variables, which are the intention to stay in Germany or not, and both social and economic integration. So if we see what the literature tell about these questions, so first let's understand integration. So according to Ager and Strang 2008, we have 4 forms of integration. So the first one is what we call markers and means. So this is everything related to the basic welfare, including employment, education, housing, and health. Second, we have social connection, which includes social bonds, which is groups of people from the same family, from the same ethnicity, from the same country. Bridges are the links with the local communities and also links with the state structures. Third, there is what we call facilitator, which is everything related to cultural knowledge, such as language. And finally, foundation, which is related to rights and citizenship. So for the impact of integration on the return migration, we have an interesting reference of Diaz and Fukema, 2011, in which they showed that only socio-cultural factors matter for the return decision. Moreover, we have the neoclassical theory that considers the return migration as a return of failure, since people, when they fail just to achieve their goals in terms of earnings, they return home. So their expectations in terms of earnings are not met. So their economic integration is not succeeded. So that's why they decide to return. However, in the new economics of labor migration, in which the return, the migration decision is based on diversifying the sources of income, people, on the contrary, once they achieve their goals, they decide to go home. So that's why it's called the return of success. And here, from neoclassical theory and new economics of labor migration, we have controversial impact of integration on the decision to return or the decision to stay in the host country. So let me say that the empirical evidence is, or supports rather the neoclassical theory, with showing positive impact of integration on the decision to stay in the host country, or negative impact on the decision to return. For economic and social integration, so let me say that commonly, or the focus in the literature was on the economic integration rather than on social integration. And here we have some interesting determinants with the impact of ethnic enclaves, the impact of language, of education. We have also even a paper in which we have the impact of social integration and political integration on economic integration. And finally, we have also some references that insist also on the role of local economic situation in the host country on economic integration of the refugees. For social integration, so the literature was less prolific about it because there is no consensus to measure it. However, there are some proxies in the literature that are trying to proxy for social integration, such as language, perceived discrimination as a barrier to social inclusion. We have also, for instance, everything related to social networks, with, for instance, the number of contacts or number of friends from the native, with the native people, and many other interesting proxies in the literature. We have also a study of Dostman in which he tried to see the impact of economic integration on social integration, which joins our intuition explained before, and but found no evidence about this impact. So coming to the data, what we use is the IAB BAMF SOEP Refugee Survey 2016, which is conducted by these institutions. So the survey contains relevant information about the refugees, their biographies before the conflict, before coming to Germany, their family context, everything related to their asylum seeker application, to their integration, to their employment status, social networks. So it's a very interesting survey, and the sample includes finally 2,132 Syrian adult refugees between 18 and 64 years old, so the working age population, and the sample is representative. So there are some waiting procedures in order to be representative of the refugees that came to Germany between 2013 and 2016. And it includes mainly people that have applied for an asylum seeker and have a response, and either a positive response to have the asylum seeker application. So for the main dependent variables, our first interest is about the intention to stay permanently in Germany. So anyway, we do not have in the survey information about the intention to return to Syria directly. So this is the only interesting information that we can consider. And moreover, we are rather interested in the intention to stay permanently in Germany, either than a decision to return. So that means that to not intend to stay permanently in Germany does not necessarily say a return to Syria, because people could intend to move to another country, for instance. So here we have a dummy variable if the respondent would like to stay permanently in Germany or not. For economic integration, use simply the employment status, if the refugee is employed or not, so inspired from what has considered in the literature. For social integration indicator, what we do is that we combine 3 proxies from the literature, and here we consider the perceived discrimination with the question about the feeling outsider or not. We have also the language, so the German-speaking proficiency, and also we have the number of German friends. So we use the polychoric ACP, which deals with many types of variables in order to construct our indicator of social integration and take the first principal component in order to consider this indicator. So as we are also interested in some other explanatory variables from the literature. So we include individual characteristics like age, sex, marital status, educational level, labor experience, and arrival year. We include also a variable about the religion, if the refugee is Sunni Muslim or not. Family networks, with having his partner in Germany, one of his children, or at least one parent or sibling in Germany. We consider social networks with the number of Syrian friends and number of friends from other countries. And finally, we consider the fact to live in a refugee accommodation or not. So some descriptive analysis in order to have an idea about the variables of the outcomes of interest. So in our sample, we have 83% of the refugees that have the intention to stay permanently in Germany, only 9% that are currently working. For social integration and the 3 proxies used, so we have 50% of the refugees that have occasionally the feeling of being outsiders, 50% that speak averagely German, and the mean number of German friends is 5. So for the methodology, so we have like 3 equations to estimate. So the first main equation is about the intention to stay permanently in Germany or not, which is explained by the 2 integration variables, economic and social integration, plus the other control variables cited before. And we, as we are also interested in determining the determinants of economic and social integration, we have a further equation of economic integration, in which we include also social integration to see the 2-way causality between them, and the further social integration equation that is also explained by economic integration, and all the control variables cited are really put in each equation. And of course, economic integration and social integration anyway, so are endogenous variables and need to be so we have endogeneity issues that need to be handled. So the most adequate model that we found in order to handle all these issues and to deal with the system of simultaneous equation model and different kinds of dependent variables, because we have 2 binary dependent variables and 1 continuous variable. So the most adequate model is the conditional mixed process method that can handle all these issues plus the endogeneity issues. So that's why we need also to consider 2 further instruments for both economic integration and social integration in the economic and social integration equation in order to handle endogeneity issues. So for economic integration, we consider the unemployment, so something related to a local country of residence, and that could impact directly economic integration of the refugees. So what we consider is the unemployment rate among the foreigners in Germany in the same country of residence in which each refugee resides, and we take the rate in 2011 before the arrival of the refugees. Moreover, for social integration, we consider the reciprocity social norm, which is a response of someone to another negative or positive response. And here we take the negative reciprocity. So this concept deals rather with social behavior and not directly with economic integration or the intention to stay in Germany. So that's why we consider this instrument. So coming to the result. So here we have three equations. The first one is the main equation of interest, which is the intention to stay permanently in Germany or not. And here we have, we find that there is a positive impact, highly significant, of social integration, but no impact of economic integration measured by employment status. So here, this results joins that of Deas and Fokema that found that only social integration matters for the decision to return, or in our case, the intention to stay in the host country. So some other interesting factors from the results. So we find that for all levels, approximately for all levels of education, we found negative, highly significant coefficients.
Jane, you have 5 minutes.
Okay.
5 minutes.
That show that the more we are educated, the less we intend to stay permanently in Germany. And anyway, as I said before, this does not mean a return to Syria, but it can mean that the more we are educated, the less we intend to stay in Germany, but maybe we intend to move to another country, not necessarily Germany. Moreover, we have, for instance, an interesting result about the fact to have a child in Germany decreases the decision to, or the intention to stay permanently in Germany. And this is in line with what was found by Dostman in one study, in which he shows that in families with higher share of daughters, for instance, which is the case also of Syrian refugees in our sample, we found that people prefer, or for cultural considerations, they do not prefer to stay permanently in the host country. Some other, okay, so we can move to the second equation, which is the employment equation or economic integration equation. So the first interesting result is that social integration impacts positively economic integration. Moreover, we have some other interesting results with the arrival year. So for instance, those who arrived in 2013 and 2014 have more opportunities to be employed than those who came in 2015. Moreover, arrival year at 2015 is the reference year because it's the majority. Moreover, we find that the fact to have the fact to have a child in Germany decreases the opportunity to be employed. So maybe having children can need much care and less time to search for employment. Other interesting results is that we find that the number of friends from the same country decreases the opportunity to work. And this is also the same result found when we live in a refugee accommodation. So maybe these two factors can limit the opportunities to be in contact with native people and to less practice the language, which can limit the opportunity to work. Okay, we found also that the experience could help to be employed, and also the English speaking proficiency. So these are two factors that help to be employed. Finally, so we have the instrument used and included in this equation that is significant with the expected negative sign. So let's move to the social integration equation. First, we find that the employment or economic integration impacts positively social integration. So finally, we have already checked the causal relationships between economic and social integration. Moreover, we find that for lower secondary and upper secondary, the level of education help to socially integrate. Moreover, we find that having a partner in Germany or a child in Germany can help to be socially help for social integration. So this is a controversial impact on economic integration, because there is controversial impact on the fact to have a child on economic integration and social integration. The fact to have friends from other countries help also for social inclusion, and this is also the case with living in a refugee accommodation. That is on itself a form of social integration in a way, with what we call bridges. And here finally we have the instrument negative reciprocity that is also significant with the expected negative sign. So finally, to conclude, what we can say, so here the most relevant result is that people that are more socially integrated have more incentives to stay, and we did not succeed to show an evidence about the economic integration on the decision to stay. Moreover, what is interesting is that there is a bidirectional relationship between both social and economic integration, and what is also interesting is that the same factors considered do not impact in the same way both social and economic integration, what is also interesting. And finally, we succeeded also to have the impact of the level of education, family context, social networks, the residence in refugee accommodation, which are also relevant determinants of our three outcomes of interest. And finally, let me say that integration process or integration policies should rather focus also on the social integration in order not only to maintain the refugees on the long run, but also because social integration is also important to economic integration also, that is interesting also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyrine, for the very interesting presentation. So our fourth paper will be presented by Osman Zeki Gökçe, who is an assistant professor of political science and international relations at Istanbul Medipol University. So this is going to be a data science paper, as far as I understand. So, and the title of the paper is Syrian Migrants, Domestic and International Politics, Parsing Out Sentiments on Turkish Twitter. Okay.
Okay. You can see my presentation, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So today I will, first of all, thanks for being here today. Today I will present our joint paper that we started to work 4 years ago, titled Syrian Refugees, Politics and Attitudes for the case of Turkish Twitter. Due to the other research projects that we embarked on, we cannot finalize this paper, and I hope with your valuable comments we can polish this paper and publish it. And this paper speaks more to the political side of refugee issue, Syrian refugee issue in Turkey. We know from the literature that migrants have become an important topic, both in domestic politics and foreign policies of the host countries, and this is also the case for Turkey, following the eruption of the Syrian civil war in 2013. Domestically, refugee inflows bring a number of policy challenges for the host state. Such challenges often arose in the areas of healthcare, housing, education, and economic integration. Committing resources to address such needs often come at the expense of other public spending. The hosting and eventual integration of refugee population can lead to frictions domestically also, and often turning into a violence. And from a foreign policy perspective, security issues emerging from such flows become a concern for the host state. So at this point, public attitudes play a key role in the host government's response to such domestic and international challenges raised by refugee inflows. So the allocation of resources towards addressing issues raised by refugee flows inevitably becomes a central topic for domestic politics, and such allocation requires commitment from various branches of government. For instance, healthcare service to refugees is accompanied by language and social assistance. Similarly, housing assistance often requires concomitant investments. Such refugee policies come at significant cost and carry the potential to crowd out other spending items in public finances, which may also end up with some kind of repercussions on public. Security issues can also shape public opinion and constrain host government's policies. The violent clashes, for instance, erupted between Buddhists and Muslim guest workers from Myanmar in Malaysia in 2013 exemplify such a mechanism. So raising public concern for such a sensitive topic in turn forced the Malaysian government to reject a policy of wholesale acceptance of Rohingya refugees to the country. Moreover, the management of refugee flows often requires substantial international effort and negotiation. Many Syrian refugees, joined by refugees from other less developed countries such as Afghanistan or Somalia, wanted to settle in a European country and decided to use Turkey as a transit state. The chaos and the humanistic drama that engulfed the plight of these refugees frequently pitted Turkey against member states of the EU as well as the European Commission. So within this context, the host public's attitudes can either bolster or weaken a state's bargaining position in international arena. On the one hand, public's pressure on the government with electoral consequences looming in the background can result in host country getting a better deal in a multilateral bargaining setting. On the other hand, a too hostile public sentiment toward refugees can strip a host government to credibly commit in such instances of multilateral bargaining and lead to a breakdown of negotiations. So the potential role that public attitudes play in shaping refugee policies of a host country in turn highlights the need to better understand the nature of these attitudes. So this role is especially salient in Turkey based on the statistics or the poll results on 2015. Recent poll, this poll found 84% of Turkish citizens are concerned with Syrian refugees in Turkey. 73% want Syrian refugees to go back to Syria, and 68% believe more restrictive policies should be adopted against Syrian refugees in Turkey. So when we look at the Turkish side, the vast amount of Syrian refugees in Turkey, exceeding 3 million refugees by 2016 official figures, have fueled debates in the country on a diverse set of issues. When we look at the media and reports on Syrian refugees, we can see some diverse topics were highlighted. At the domestic level, these issues range from employment and rising house rents in big cities to public health and epidemic risks, from changing Sunni Alawite demographic balance in Anatolian towns and villages due to the settling of Syrian refugees in these towns, to the burden service rendered to Syrian refugees, which impose on extra burden on public finance. So many Turkish citizens voiced disapproval when Turkish government floated the idea of placing Syrian refugees in government-owned housing developments. The tone of disapproval was even stronger when government hinted at the possibility of granting Turkish citizenship to Syrian refugees. At the international level, on the other hand, the role Syrian refugee issue should play in Turkey's foreign policy towards Syria and the Middle East, against terror organizations, Daesh, YPG, PKK, and other organizations, and even towards the European Union, which constitute important points of debate. So the increasing salience of Syrian refugees in Turkish politics also manifested itself in the electoral manifestos of political parties for the June 2015 election. The topic of Syrian refugees continued to be a separate topic for each major political party manifesto. So despite their importance, so our knowledge on the details of public attitudes on Syrian refugees is scant. One of the reasons underlying the paucity of knowledge relates to the conflation of multiple topics into a single concept, the Syrian issue. Okay, so the Syrian issue is an amalgamation of various topics. Each of these topics can often be framed in varying contexts. For instance, the prospect of giving citizenship to Syrian refugees can be framed through security. For instance, questions like, what if once they become citizens, Syrian refugees pursue secession of Hatay province from Turkey? It's a serious issue. Or through economics. For instance, a question that can be asked is, why exacerbate the unemployment problem in Turkey by granting Syrian refugees citizenship? So in relation, available public opinion data on Syrian refugees are mostly confined to measuring general attitudes towards Syrian refugees and are unable to parse out attitudes towards individual dimensions of the Syrian issue. So our contribution comes at this point. So despite the extent to which the issue of Syrian refugees has permeated Turkish politics and foreign policy, little systematic analysis has been done to assess, first, the relative importance of these issues vis-a-vis each other, security concerns or economic burdens associated with Syrian refugees, voiced more on Turkish Twitter. And second, how these attitudes correlate with other attitudes regarding Turkish politics. For instance, thus expressing sympathy for a certain political party in Turkey make an individual more likely to highlight issues relating to refugees and economics. Okay, so to answer these questions and to further our understanding of attitudes towards Syrian refugees, in Turkey we adopt a novel approach and look at public opinion on Turkey. So to do so, we have taken 4-month snapshot of Turkish tweets on Syrian refugees and assessed the picture these tweets depict regarding the refugees. Between May 2, 2016 and August 31, 2016, we collect these tweets. The keywords to collect these tweets are mülteci, refugee in English, and or the word Suriye, as well as all the inflections in Turkish, Suriyeli, Suriyeliler, etc., and spellings with English letters such as mülteci. So then tweets in languages other than Turkish were filtered out. So we eliminate them. This process rendered more than 60,000 tweets, which were posted between May 2nd and August 25th. The actual number of tweets that contained the word mülteci and Suriye were considerably higher during this period. However, Twitter guidelines significantly limited the number of tweets that could be legally retrieved by our query. So Twitter doesn't publicly disclose how it creates the sample to respond to a query. Still, it has officially declared that a response to a query provides a statistically relevant sample of 1% of the full firehouse. So therefore, we have no a priori reason to believe that Twitter censors results from the query in a non-random way. As a result, our sample is sufficiently large for inferences made below. So after taking this snapshot, we developed novel code. This code allowed us to cluster similar tweets together. Standard document clustering methods in data mining do not work well on Twitter data due to several reasons. The first reason is that tweets are very short documents that contain 140 characters at most. The second point is that users tend to use less formal language on Twitter. Misspelled words, emoticons, and abbreviations make it harder to obtain good, clean cluster for standard document clustering methods. To address this challenge, we utilize an algorithm that utilizes an adaptive clustering approach for Twitter, which is based on form lexical similarity, namely longest common subsequence. So one of our paper documents this technique and its application to Twitter data in detail. So LCS, longest common subsequence, as you can see in this is a kind of a computational algorithm, is defined as a set of characters from two sequences of characters that are common between these two sequences following the same order. For instance, if the first tweet is an apple a day is good, then the second tweet is eating apple daily is good for teeth. Then LCS between two sequences is apple is good. This LCS acts as a proxy for how similar two tweets are in terms of content. Also note that spaces and punctuation marks are not taken into account. Okay, so our algorithm first randomly chooses tweet called a cluster header and assign other tweets under this cluster if the other tweets pass a similarity threshold. The same process is then repeated until no tweets can be grouped. The level similarity is defined by us, by the authors. It can be scalable, so we can use this, we can apply this methodology to all alphabetical languages, and it can substantially reduce the burden of coding. So as you can see from this table, for instance, if we choose, for instance, 0.8 as a threshold, then it reduces our coding burden almost by 82%. So this threshold rendered almost 3,500 groups with at least 2 tweets in each of them. And we can save us from coding almost 82% of other tweets. So as you can see, if you set threshold for the lower levels, reduction in coding burden increases. So I think I covered this. So this is a problematic, some problems regarding whether to render data for collection at random, but we need to rely on their explanations. So after having clustered tweets under cluster headers, our next task was to hand code each of these cluster header tweets for content. So these cluster headers were coded with respect to the following content: the specific issue, if any, raised related to migrants. Second is whether any political parties were referred to the tweets. Attitudes toward, 5 minutes. Okay. Attitudes toward any of these political parties. And finally, whether any terrorist organization were referred to in the tweet. So whether the tweet entails a positive or negative or neutral tones toward refugees. So for the sake of brevity, I don't present results regarding terrorist organizations and attitudes toward refugees. So these are the results for the issue prevalence. As you can see, we have physical security inside Turkey, physical security outside Turkey, security of refugees, economics, social aid or social services, identity and ethnicity, citizenship, and demographic balance. So if an issue mentioned does not subscribe to any of these categories above, we code it as other. If no specific issue was mentioned, the tweet was coded under general category. So you can see weighted and unweighted frequencies of results. So not surprisingly, as you can see from the previous table, Turkish security is the far most enunciated topic related to Syrian refugees. Tweets regarding refugee safety and well-being constitute the second most popular topic among others. However, we need to note that these categories are not mutually exclusive. A tweet may mention more than one issue. As you can see from this table, Twitter users frequently relate Turkey's domestic security with issues regarding Turkish citizenship, allegedly plan to convert to Syrian refugees, and topics regarding identity or ethnicity, especially with respect to this, also appear in relation to Turkish domestic security. So we also coded with respect to parties reference. As you can see, table shows that AKP crowds other parties out in the online political debate with 86%. This high ratio may indicate Twitter users best of a certain degree of culpability to AKP government regarding Syrian refugees. So we can also see the frequencies or the weighted tabulations of attitudes towards each party. As you can see, AKP is referred mostly by negative attitudes compared to positive ones. So here, our final set of analysis is on whether the nature of manifest attitudes toward AKP in tweets change with respect to specific issues that relate to Syrian refugees. Chi-square independence test results for these 4 tables shows that there's a significant association between attitudes towards AKP and issues discussed in tweets, except issues related to Turkish citizenship. Tweets that praise AKP touch upon issues related to security of Turkey and economy considerably less compared to tweets that hold negative attitudes towards AKP. For instance, when we look at the table A for the security, positive is, so there's a kind of a discrepancy or cleavage between positive and negative attitudes. For instance, 12% of pro-AKP tweets versus 27 of anti-AKP tweets for security of Turkey, as you can see. However, as ratios in table T show that tweets that praise AKP tend to talk more about issues regarding social aid. So in this topic, pro-AKP tweets are relatively more than anti-AKP tweets. So our findings suggest that security concerns trump over all others for those who tweet on Syrian and Turkish language. The findings also indicate that the issue of Syrian refugees is highly politicized. One, as almost half of the tweets on Syrian refugees also mention at least one political party, and manifested sympathy towards Turkish political parties also correlate with issues raised on Twitter. So AKP supporters are less likely to relate Syrian refugees to Turkish security. And lastly, pro-Syrian refugee tweets do not necessarily stem from humanitarian concerns, but many pro-Syrian refugees tweets carry sectarian and racist undertones, which this kind of conclusion can be seen in the paper. So thanks. To wrap up, so I need to finish here. So thanks for your listening.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss all 4 papers briefly. So some of the points that I'm going to raise in my discussion are already answered by the presenters, but I will still raise those issues just to mention that those are important points, at least in my view. So, and after my discussion, I will give the floor to the presenters in the order that they presented their papers to address my comments. And if there are any additional questions from the floor and among the audience, then we will also try to, I will let the presenters also address those questions. Okay, so now I'm going to share my slides. All right, I will start with the first paper. Okay, I hope you can see the slides. So the first paper is presented by Alexandra. It's a co-authored paper by many authors that I cannot see right now their names, measuring the impact of multi-purpose cash assistance on SDG progress in humanitarian settings, the case of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So let me summarize the paper first. So the main goal of the paper is to measure the short and medium-term impact of multi-purpose cash assistance provided by the World Food Program of UNHCR on the welfare of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So the authors also discuss some longer-term perspective. They employ a fuzzy regression discontinuity design by using data on approximately 12,000 Syrian refugee households in 2008 and 2019. And the data collection is based on 3 waves, and it is performed at 6-month intervals. So here is a summary of the findings. So the findings are almost entirely positive. So they find that the MPC is associated with reduced food insecurity among beneficiaries, and it is also associated with an increase in residential housing, an increase in non-formal education among children aged 5 to 9, and also an increase in economic activity paralleled by a decrease in unemployment, an increase in access to primary health care, and a decrease in the decision-making power of female respondents related to minor household expenditures. So here are my brief comments and some questions. So I think this is a very important topic. Why? Because we know that there are many cash assistance programs going on in hosting countries. So this is the one analyzed in the paper is a multi-purpose cash assistance program. I know a huge conditional cash transfer program to encourage school attendance of Syrian kids in Turkey. So the financing burden of this, cash assistance programs is huge. Large amounts of funds have been directed for this purpose, but the problem is that we don't have a sound and concrete. So there are some attempts, but we do not know the causal effect of those programs on the targeted outcomes. So there are not right now some attempts organized by some so I know a program carried out by World Bank to estimate the impact of several cash assistance programs, but definitely we need more of them. So this is, I think, a very important paper for policy making along those lines. So here are some of my questions. So the first one is, I understand, but I mean, the paper needs to make it clear why they use a fuzzy design, right? So we know from by looking at the design, it looks like a quite sharp cutoff. And also in terms of the motivation figure presented by Alexandra, it also looks like a very sharp response. So, I mean, I think it needs some motivation to, to elaborate more on why the authors do a fuzzy design as opposed to a sharp RDD. So Alexandra said that there is no jump in the observables around the cutoff, but I think it would be good to, I don't remember that I saw it in the paper, but it would be nice to demonstrate at least visually that there is no jump in observables around the cutoff. So there is another issue. The selection of villages, to my understanding, is not quite transparent, right? So I think it's very important for the results of the analysis, for representativeness, etc. So it needs some more explanation. Another question is, so there are 3 waves. So is there any attrition? So is there any visible and statistically significant change in sample characteristics across those 3 waves? And the next is, are the results robust to changes in window sizes around the cutoff? So that's another issue. There were some explanations in the paper, but I think it needs to be clarified further. And finally, I couldn't see it in the paper. I couldn't catch whether Alexandra mentioned this or not. So how are the standard errors are calculated in terms of the clustering of the standard errors? I think it's also very important to make the estimates convincing. All right, so next paper. So the title of the second paper was The Determinants of Defense Spending in the Gulf Region, Evidence from Seemingly Unrelated Regressions. So now, in terms of methodology, this is not my, I do not know a lot. So from theoretical econometrics, I know SUR, but I mean, this is not my area of research. So I don't know the details of the method, but still, I will try to provide some comments on this. So again, a brief summary. So the main goal of the paper is to examine the determinants of demand for military expenditures in the Gulf region. So there were 8 countries examined in the paper: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, United UAE, and Oman. So the authors use a partial adjustment model in a panel setting estimated with the standard seemingly unrelated regressions approach. And they also consider in the regressions the institutional inertia issue and other strategic variables. And the main finding is that military expenditures are influenced by both economic and strategic factors with a high degree of heterogeneity across different countries. And they also find that some countries respond more to economic factors, while others exhibiting more sensitivity to strategic factors. So there, I have some, again, brief comments. So I think, so one thing that I couldn't see in the paper is that, so I think the paper would benefit more from a careful and detailed discussion of the underlying mechanisms, right? So, I mean, what drives the change in the relative importance of economic versus strategic factors? So I think it would be very nice to have a nice narrative, you know, to put the findings together and to tell a nice story about the findings. And the second issue is that, so this is a bit, you know, out of sample, because, you know, all the countries in the sample are resource-rich countries. But I mean, have you considered the issue of resource curse, right? So what's the, well, this may be related to my the first comment. So, well, is there any, you know, underlying economic mechanism in terms of like fiscal dependency that may be deriving the results of the results that are presented in the paper? I think this may be a critical issue. I remember seeing some papers mentioning the issue of resource curse along these lines, but I mean, it would be nice to, you know, to try to address it analytically in the current setting. So the paper also only utilizes seemingly unrelated regressions. So as far as I remember, there are some more alternatives in terms of like time series techniques to seemingly unrelated regressions. So it would be nice to use at least one more method to, you know, convince the reader that the reader's audience that, I mean, the results are robust to alternative techniques. And so again, as far as if I understood correctly, so there are some, so the regressions were specific to the country. So the authors performed separate regressions for each country. So is there any pooled result? I mean, by pooled, I mean bringing all the countries together and using country fixed effects. I mean, just to see the aggregate tendency in terms of like, so we know that for some there's heterogeneity, but what is the main results in aggregate? I mean, whether economic factors dominate or strategic factors dominate in aggregate, it would be nice to see this, the big picture. Okay, so the third paper, the title is Economic and Social Integration of Syrian Refugees and Their Intention to Stay in Germany. I think this also nicely complements the political economy setting in this session. So this is again a Syrian refugee paper, but it's nice to see it from a European country perspective. So the main goal of the paper is to investigate the impact of social and economic integration on the Syrian refugees' intention to stay permanently in Germany. So it's a very relevant issue. Also, the paper studies the determinants of these two integration components and the causal relationship between them. I think this is another important issue. The main finding is that there is a two-way bidirectional relationship between the social and economic integration components, and they also find only a significant impact of social integration on the intention to stay permanently in Germany, but no evidence of an impact of the economic integration component. They find that the arrival year, the level of education, the family context in terms of like having a child in Germany or not, social networks, and the residence in a refugee accommodation facility are relevant additional determinants of the outcomes of interest in the paper. All right, some comments. So as far as I understand, the authors bring together the several questions and you know, form social and economic integration components. But I mean, one issue is that, of course, I'm sure that there has to be some, you know, alternative ways to bring together those components. So, is there any like sensitivity of the results to those two components, right? So, what if we construct social and economic integration variables by using different components? So the other issue is that the two variables are highly endogenous, and the results may change depending on content of the integration variable. So that endogeneity is the key question. I'm sure it's going to appear continuously in terms of like referee reports or not. So that endogeneity is the key. So so I'm going to switch to the third point because it is related. So you claim causality here. So I think it's not very easy to detect causality in the case of an existence of endogeneity between those two highly related variables. So I think it would be good to, you know, to use alternative definitions of the variables and check the strength of the results by using alternative methods. So one other thing is that maybe you can use a formal a causal factor model. Again, I think such models are used by Heckman and co-authors in their research on the impact of cognitive and non-cognitive skills on labor market outcomes of children, so and education and labor market outcomes of children. I think those methods can also be, you know, used in this context too. It would be nice to see the results, to see whether the results change or not. So they also nicely, because well, cognitive and non-cognitive skills are also endogenous, similar to the endogeneity of those two components here. So I think those methods would be very nice to use in such a setting. And the other issue is that, so I know that, well, the survey claims representativeness, but I remember that there are some issues raised in the papers using this survey about the representativeness. So it is representative in terms of what? So is it representative of the Syrian population in Germany, Syrian population in other host countries, or Syrian population in Syria? So I think that's really a key question. So what it represents. So if it is representative of the Syrian population in Germany, this doesn't necessarily mean that the survey is representative, because, you know, it may be relevant for Germany, but it may not be relevant for other European countries. So I think it may be good to discuss this representativeness issue in a bit deeper sense. And the final paper is the very interesting paper presented by Osman Zeki. So the title is Syrian Migrants, Domestic and International Politics, Parsing Out Sentiments on Turkish Twitter. So the main goal of the paper is to understand the role of public opinion as played in shaping Turkey's policies towards Syrian refugees. So the paper used some data science techniques, some data retrieval techniques in terms of data collected from online social media, Twitter. And they find that security concerns trump over all others. So they also find that political views are heavily involved in the formation of the concerns and beliefs. And another finding is that being pro-Syrian refugee does not necessarily associate with humanitarian concerns, because they say that, that those, you know, attitudes may be driven by political motives. So some comments. Well, since the data comes from a snapshot of 4 months, I think this may generate a bias, because, you know, the attitudes fluctuate a lot. So one thing that would be useful to discuss is whether any period-specific or episodic issues that might be affecting the results. So I think this is very important, because, well, we know that currently in all host countries, the attitudes are getting, you know, becoming slightly negative, right, over time. So this is something that we observe consistently across all host countries, especially in Turkey. So it might be nice to understand whether there is any period-specific episodic issues or not. So another issue, this is a more technical issue. Is there any inaccuracies regarding the dictionary construction? Because, you know, I know that I have some students doing this issue, well, Twitter-based research for other contexts, but I mean, they continuously hit this rock, right? So whether the dictionary captures the attitudes correctly or not. So for English, we know that those dictionaries are more consistent and they can capture the attitudes and the tricks of the language use better in English. But I mean, we know that this is problematic for all other languages. So maybe it may be nice also to use the English tweets by Turkish users. So I know that that's a different sample, but in terms of the consistency of the dictionary use, it would be nice to, use some original English tweets at least to see to check the, the consistency of the findings and whether any, dependency of the results on the language used to construct the dictionary. And the other is that we know from the literature that there are two important issues, factors that are shaping the attitudes. One is labor markets, employment, and the other is the other economic effects. Mostly those are all welfare issues, right? So how the resources are redistributed to refugees in terms of, like, let's say, tax receipts. So it would be nice to also discuss whether there are any interactions between those alternative, main variables discussed in the literature and the political variables that the authors discuss. And the final issue is that I don't think that, well, the authors will have an affirmative answer on this. I know that this information is very limited, but is it possible to have any sense of heterogeneity among users in terms of the characteristics like age, education, region? Maybe that the authors may use. I saw some similar papers. Some authors are using some, machine learning techniques to extract some information about the exogenous characteristics of the users. So it may be interesting to, to gauge some extra information about those characteristics, just to investigate the underlying heterogeneity. Maybe, it may be also feasible to use some proxies at least to represent those heterogeneity elements. Okay, so this was my final slide. So I will give the floor to the authors. But first, let's see if there is any other question from the floor, just to let authors respond to all questions in only one session. Okay, so as far as I can see, there is no other questions. So let's start with Alexandra and move in the order that the authors presented their papers.
All right, thank you, Samir, for your comments, very valuable comments. I just want to note that there was an updated version of the paper, but we presented it a bit late. So it does tackle some of the points you raised, so thanks for this. Regarding using fuzzy versus sharp, yeah, I do agree that, compliance, it's quite high. It's at like 94, 95%. But we thought like these 5% would warrant going for the fuzzy. But in the updated analyses we conduct, we also try variations of sharp and fuzzy. Regarding the discontinuity of observables at the cutoff, so most, in the updated version of the paper, we do show these results, and most of the observables are not discontinuous at the cutoffs, except for like 3 household size, age dependency for certain waves. But even though this is discontinuous, the difference in means is quite negligible. Regarding the selection of villages, actually what we do is we extract a random sample of the population in these 3 regions. The only thing based on we around the cutoff, so we select a bandwidth of scores and we randomly extract the sample. All we do is we exclude villages that include less than 10 households for logistic purposes. So we use probability proportion to size to do this random sampling. This is on the selection of villages. In terms of standard errors, we use the delta method to estimate them. And then in terms of testing the different windows, you were mentioning the different windows around the cutoff. So we did, in this version of the paper, this is not included, but we had tested for this paper different bandwidths around the cutoffs for wave 1, and in the following versions we did try using multiple versions of the bandwidths, and results were mostly robust and consistent. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Semi, for these really well thought and well placed comments. I really find them useful, and so we will definitely take a look at these and implement into the paper before publication hopefully in a good journal. As for the comments, I think these are really good. I find the resource curves approach really useful. I think we couldn't take a look at it because of data issues, but I will definitely consider it and look at other papers if they were able to find some data on these countries, because it is really, difficult. These data issues, especially about humanitarian, social data, is very difficult to find for all countries in a specific time period. So this might be a problem, but I'll take a look at it. And also, now for the methodology, of course, it is customary in general to use multiple methods, trying to argue that your methodology or findings are robust. But I think we were already good with that, with the methodology, especially the partial adjustment plus SUR. I think it's a very good match to study this type of problem. But we can maybe take a look at a more standard panel methodology as an additional maybe look at it. But I want to mention that our methodology is more broad in terms of we can do more analysis that we cannot do with a standard panel model, like cross-country testing and stuff like that. And especially I'm taking a look at the importance of economic versus strategic factors. I think there is a good room for additional discussion in the paper for why these are more important for some countries while it's the other way around for the other countries. So in general, in conclusion, I really find these very useful and definitely take a look at all of them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Semih, for your comments and suggestions. So I will just answer quickly on some questions. So the first one, I think it's about the sensitivity of the result on the construction of social and economic integration. So of course, there is a big effort of searching for adequate proxy for economic integration. So of course, I have tried many indicators for economic integration. I have tried also with the fact to be active or not just to search for employment or not. For social integration, I think this was really the challenge, because there are many interesting questions in the survey, and I was trying with many variables that could be more relevant than others. I add some proxies, but I think the challenge and the difficulty is in the estimation, because as I have instruments also in order to handle indigeneity, I need to have instruments that could be valid statistically. So the estimation of simultaneous equation, I think it's complicated. So that's why I need to have the adequate variables that could be adequate with the good instrument, because I need. So this was a challenge. And finally, I selected these proxies. But maybe I think in the paper, maybe I should develop a part in which I put all the work done in order to think about other proxies, or to say there are other proxies that we tried, or to make all the other alternatives use. So maybe this could be developed in the paper. The second question, I think it's about the representativity of the sample. So of course, yeah, I agree with you about the representativity. So the sample is representative of the Syrian refugees that came to Germany between 2013 and 2016, who filled an asylum application before 2016. And let me say that higher sample probabilities were assigned to people who had already received an answer to their asylum application with an accordance of the asylum protection, rather than those for whom the asylum procedure is still ongoing, or that have received a rejection of their asylum application. So this is mentioned anyway in the paper, but it's really that it is representative of these refugees in Germany and with these characteristics. And finally, the question of causality and other methods. So, of course, there is a robustness check part in the paper, in which I'm trying to use other models, other sample models, that in order to check the robustness of the results with changing the method. So I used some sample probit estimation, some OLS estimation in order, and I saw that my results were really robust to the estimation method. So, thank you.
Okay. So thank you, Zeina, for your valuable comments. So for the first comment, so the biasness issue, so it's the most prominent problem while studying on Twitter and public opinion. As you said, attitudes fluctuate, and this may stem from the attitudes of opinion leaders in Twitter, some other events that may take place during this period, bombs, attacks, any kind of attacks from terrorist organization, any kind of bad economic indicators announced during this period. It might also affect the attitude. So nowadays we were working on working to add some kind of descriptives regarding to show us some kind of economic state, or the economic condition of Turkey, or for in terms of security, the condition of Turkey in terms of security during this period. And we are trying to put this in the paper, and we will analyze whether there's any change between this period and post-period and pre-period of this kind of our period of interest. In terms of dictionary, so after reducing the number of tweets, we coded tweets by hand, as you know, 10,000 tweets coded by 2 researchers, because in terms of dictionary, Turkish languages has some problems. So I don't know in English, but it's a kinaye kind of things, kinayeli sözler. We cannot separate this kind of things by machines, by machine learnings, etc. So, however, we can also use your suggestions, having another pool of tweets in English, and we can check whether we can test our dictionary. So comparing or analyzing the interactions of underlying variables, employment versus other economic effects, quite interesting, and I think we can do it, and we can improve our we can recode our findings, our tweets, and we can do such analysis. Heterogeneity among users is the most difficult one, because unless users disclose their age, day of birth, or the location, we cannot know this. So I think this is the part that we need to improve for further research endeavors. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I think we did a very good job in terms of both time management and also I think in terms of the content of the session. I learned a lot from all 4 papers, and I hope that the feedback provided in the session were also useful for the authors and the papers. So this is the end of this session.